This process should start by addressing the dire lack of financial resources. Without sufficient funding, the EU can't meet the expectations of the people. And because it fails to perform the function it was designed for, the Union loses its legitimacy. The refugee crisis illustrates the problem. At least 30 billion euros a year will be needed both inside the Union to build effective border and asylum agencies, to ensure dignified reception conditions, fair asylum procedures, and opportunities for integration, as well as outside its borders to support refugee hosting countries and to spur job creation throughout Africa and the Middle East. The political and economic costs of inaction would be even greater. Brexit is the starkest example of these consequences, but we also have compromised the Schengen system, driving up economic costs. Given that its very survival is at stake, the EU should be putting all its available resources to use. And yet, the AAA credit of the Union has barely been deployed. This is the height of irresponsibility. The current approach reallocates minimum resources from the EU budget and then asks member states to contribute to various dedicated vehicles, such as the Turkish facility and the Trust Fund for Syria. This can be only a temporary solution, as it is neither sustainable nor large enough. In order to raise the necessary funds in the short term, the EU should engage in what I call surge funding. This entails raising debt by leveraging the EU's relatively small budget rather than scraping together insufficient funds year by year. There is a strong case to be made for using the balance sheet of the EU itself. Tapping into the AAA credit of the EU has the additional advantage of providing a much-needed economic stimulus for Europe. With global interest rates at historic lows, now is a particularly favorable moment to take on such debt. Spending a large amount at the outset would make it much easier to manage immigration and will allow the EU to respond effectively to the most dangerous consequences of the crisis. These include the kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that fueled Brexit, support for extremist political parties, and despondency among those seeking refuge in Europe who now find themselves ostracized and marginalized. Making large initial investments will help tip the economic, political, and social dynamics away from xenophobia towards constructive outcomes that benefit refugees and host countries alike. To finance these efforts over the long term, new taxes will have to be levied sooner or later. In the short term, unused funds in already existing financial instruments should be put to use. Of course, raising more debt with the current budget will eventually pose deeper questions in the light of the limited resources of the EU budget. The situation has gotten worse over the years as the real own resources of the EU budget, such as customs duties, have shrunk. It's now time to drastically reshape how the EU's own resources are raised. The reduction of the EU's resources in 2014 to 1.23% of GDP was a tragic mistake. The EU can't survive with a budget of this size. That's why I was greatly encouraged last year when Minister Schäuble suggested a pan-European gasoline tax. The European Parliament should seriously consider this idea. A stable source of revenues would greatly increase the amount that the EU can borrow and would allow it to finance new initiatives. I appreciate that this is a difficult task because the principle of unanimity is a major obstacle. But an EU agency could act as a coalition of the willing. For instance, the Single Resolution Board that raises a levy on the banks could in principle borrow money against that levy. The EU area also needs a budget of its own. The ESM can be seen as the embryo of such a budget, but it's subject to the veto of national parliaments. You should encourage member states to bring the ESM under the control of the European Commission and the European Parliament. This would also allow extending its use to other purposes, like the creation of a European unemployment scheme. Finally, two items stand out among the legacy expenditures that cripple the EU budget. Cohesion policy, with 32% of expenditures, and agriculture, with 38%. These need to be sharply reduced in the next budget cycle. To sum up, the refugee crisis poses an existential threat to Europe. As I said before, it's the height of irresponsibility to allow the EU to disintegrate without utilizing all its resources. Throughout history, governments have issued bonds in response to national emergencies. When should the AAA credit of the EU be put to use, if not at a moment when the European Union is in mortal danger? Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Soros. Merci de cette analyse et de ces propositions qui peuvent susciter des réactions.